Alright, so today we're going to go through materials in VRED, you know, the basics of how to apply them and all the settings we might expect to interact with when we're putting our models together for rendering or animations or whatever it may be. So obviously we're going to open the material editor. I always tend to work with the simple UI off. So if your interface looks a bit different from mine, it might be just because you've got the simple UI turned on. So anyway, let's open up materials and we can see all I have is one material set up here, which is just a plastic. But let's go over some of these options on the screen because some of them are a bit confusing, some are duplicated, and we should have a look at it to try and understand it. So first things first, we'll start at the top. We've got file where we can load materials, load animation, render preview images and statistics. None of this really matters. Edit, merge duplicate materials can be useful when you start to get heaps and heaps filled up. Remove unused materials, that's in there as well, but there's an option for that down here. Again, I rarely use these, much like file and edit. I don't use them that much. In fact, I don't even use any of these up the top. I prefer to just right click and that kind of brings up a lot of the settings we seem to need anyway. So straight away, top options up here. Not that useful. Across the side, this is just organization. So if I was to select this plastic, you can add in tags to it, so then you can sort by specific tags and go through there and find stuff. Again, this is probably just for very small specific examples. If you've got a really big complicated scene and you've got heaps and heaps and heaps of materials and you need to organize them, for most cases we probably won't need them. So pretty much everything over here we don't really need anyway. When I do find out how to hide that, I would probably just hide that away as well, because it's not really that relevant. What is important is what's in here, which is our actual materials, our studio, our environment, and these down the bottom. So we can click here to create a new material or an environment. We'll get onto environments later. We can duplicate the currently selected material. So if we want to just copy our plastic, we can do that. We can create a group from selected materials. I rarely ever do that. Generally not a need. Select nodes. So when you have a material selected, if you go ahead and click select nodes, we can see on the left it selects everything here. We can turn on boundings to better represent that. And what that does is it selects every object that has that material applied to it. So for a better example, what I'll do is I'll make this black. Now when we select plastic 1 and select the nodes, it's going to select all the materials that have plastic 1. Obviously the sphere has plastic 3 applied to it, so it doesn't select the sphere. This is super useful for when you're changing materials. You can select one material, select all the nodes, and that brings us to our next button, which is apply to selected nodes. So now we've got these nodes selected. When we click another material, we still have these highlighted on the side here, and if we've got boundings turned on. So if we then click apply material to all selected nodes, that's going to apply the black material to these nodes. So that's a really good way of quickly changing materials on your objects from one to another or merging them all up. This option here removes all unused materials, great for cleaning up your workspace. So again, if everything is plastic 3, nothing is plastic 1 or 2. So by clicking that, it gets rid of all of them. And then deletes the selected material if you want to get rid of one material at a time. So that's pretty much the basic interface. So this doesn't really matter. The options up here don't really matter. Okay, so we can turn those off. Great, now we're learning. So we do want our preview and we do want our attributes. So look at that. We can turn groups and tags off, and now we're dealing with a simpler interface. Awesome. When it comes to creating materials, we want to come down here, or we could simply right click. This does give us pretty much all the options we'd want anyway. So we've got the option of, well, there's a bunch of them here, and we're just going to go over the standard ones and then look at some of the options within those standard ones to understand, well, what most people would experience if you're designing something very specific. You might have to go and explore some of these attributes yourself, but for the most cases, we'll cover them here. So straight away, Phong as a material, everyone asks, what is Phong? It's a good question. I still don't really know what it means, but essentially it's just a name given to a material that's made up of different stuff. If we apply the default Phong material and the default plastic material next to each other, there's a little bit of a difference. We can see some of the settings are different in that the glossy color, and it's got some different ways it works with its roughness and reflectivities. It actually uses diffuse backscattering as opposed to reflectivity. I would probably just not use Phong materials unless, again, there's like one of those really specific things where you need it. Because plastic is probably going to be the most useful material for us to make things out of. So even though, yes, it says plastic, this is where we can make our timbers or even our fabrics. We'll go over the actual woven fabrics and why they're sometimes a bad idea. But in terms of making something that's meant to represent a real material, plastic's generally the best option. We have reflective plastics as well. So the difference here is that the reflective plastic has like another layer of reflectivity to it in the way it actually calculates it as well. So if you know, so it doesn't actually have a roughness texture option because it's absolutely going to be shiny and glossy. So if you know there's somewhere that's going to use a reflective plastic, so you know, areas on, well, looking in front of me right now, my keyboard, my computer monitor has a black bezel around it, and that's a shiny black plastic. Those kinds of plastics you see on products that are just super glossy, super flat. Some car dashboards have them, like around the stereo controls or the in-car entertainment, whatever you call it. So, yeah, if you're going to have something that's just purely a reflective plastic material, that's the one case where you'd use reflective plastic. Otherwise, just going with the regular plastic will work quite well. The resolution of this cone is pretty garbage, but it doesn't really matter too much anyway. So, that's pretty much the plastics, but we'll get back to the main plastic and really go over some of the options for that. What I'll do is just do that, and we want to select all the nodes from these and apply the basic plastic, and now we can clean it up. Boom, back to just the standard one. All right, so then what we have when we go to create, this is where we get to our metal materials. We have chrome and we have brushed metal. So even though, yes, it says chrome, you might think it's only for super shiny metals, but this actually is where we would do just about any kind of metal. So you can go through some of the default settings here and play around with the silver or the gold. copper, that kind of thing, it does kind of work. You can play around with the reflection color up here to kind of get your own specific material look, but a lot of it comes from the saturation, the contrast as well, of how you really want your your gold to look. It can be really tricky to get things like gold to work properly. I think I have glow turned on in my settings. That shouldn't be on. But yeah, so it gives you a huge amount of control, but obviously you can see it's not just for making chrome materials. This is really any kind of metal object. So for aluminium it works, and it does give it that that sort of fading off from lighter to darker that you do get on metals. There are some pretty cool options here where you start to get the slight tones going through. Again, I wouldn't be too concerned if you use one that says iridium if you're not doing something out of iridium, but if it looks right, you can kind of go with it. Sometimes for metals, I tend to actually use the metallic car paint as well. It really depends. So there's that option, but and we can also, if we want to make something start to look like a proper like heavy metal object, that's where we come in and start playing around with the bump texture on them. And right away you can see that's much more of what you expect when you think of, well, something like a rough metal surface. Even if you bring that intensity right down, that's when you can start making it look like a polished metal surface. So there is a lot of control there to get various kinds of metals, not just chrome. When we create a brushed metal, this is purely for getting that, well, that brushed metal appearance. So you might see that on like a fridge or a phone case, or a lot of kitchen objects these days have that brushed metal look. So like coffee machines, laptops, and yeah, again, automotive, sometimes little pillars have them or whatever it may be. There's actually a little bit of setup required to do this properly, to set up a brush metal. So first we want to get a bit of a bump texture going using the structure. And it's going to look very similar, except very, very small to our standard metal. But this is where we have to play around with our brush orientation. So what this does essentially gives a structure to the surface, and here we determine how that structure works. And by dragging it in one way over the other, we can start to get this brushed looking texture going. So let's do that and bring that up. So we can get, well, at this point it's a really heavy brush texture, but when we bring it down, we can get that sort of soft brushed effect on the surface. So yeah, this really works quite effective, and then you can have it affect the clear coat as well. Well, this cone is just garbage, but that doesn't matter. And the example of the plane that I'd set up isn't really working that great. It's at a weird angle for the light, but we can see it does have that option there. And yeah, we can play around with the way it has roughness in one direction or not. So if you want the light to scatter across it or not. But yeah, so if you're doing a brush material, there's a whole thing set up purely for that. Every other sort of metallic or metal object, I would go with chrome. From there, we have our car paints, which are quite simple. They are pretty much the same thing, but with added levels of complexity. So what I'll do for this one, I'll actually create some more spheres so we can see exactly how they look. So I'm just going to duplicate these. I'm going to hide that cone because it's terrible, and we don't need the plane there either. That's not really helping us that much. Turns out spheres are really good for this. Okay, so that's fine. All right, so with our three spheres, I'm going to apply metallic color paint to the middle one, unicolor color paint to this one, and flip-flop to the one on the right. And if I can just move this over slightly, we can see there's some differences here already in the way they come in and are textured. The one in the middle is very plain. This one has that sort of metallic look to it. If we zoom in, we can see the metallic flakes that are part of the metallic material. And over on the right, we have metallic flakes. They're very small, but we also have two light colors coming into it, as we can see here with the light green and the light purple violet color. So if we come to our unicolor color paint, it is very simple. It's essentially just a base color. It gives you a really strong, vibrant color. Excellent for just pretty much painting up anything that's meant to be shiny. And you'll see often this number for reflectivity, so 0.04. The technical explanation for that is at 90 degrees to an object, it's something like 4% reflection or something. It's quite specific. What it means is generally you don't want to change it because it is a setting that is quite representative of real life reflectivity of a very glossy surface. Like you can crank it all the way up, but that's where the color starts to fade out from it, and all the way down it obviously becomes something with no reflection and just a blank sphere. So if you've got everything set up in your scene and you find that you need to tweak it a little bit, that's okay. But generally just leave that at 0.04 and play around with your other settings for reflectivity, and we'll get into that a bit more on the paint side, on the plastic side of thing. Generally, when we've got something that's got a car paint on it, so one of the three paints, we don't need to mess around with incandescence, transparency, displacement, or any of the other settings really. We just usually end up playing with these. One of the cooler options in VRED is the way to turn on orange peel. So we can see it's slightly playing up. What I'm going to do is just crank it up more. So it's meant to be representative of that orange peel texture we get when we have like a freshly painted car. There is some level of it on vehicles, and it's just helps add that little bit of realism depending on your surface. You can sort of emphasize it a bit in the way of we're doing a render and we want people to see that it, you know, we've thought about having orange peel texture on a car for the clear coat. It just adds that little bit more. It's very easy to add and play around with. And it just makes some of our reflections a little bit smoother when we transition from surfaces. So with that said, and that's pretty much all there is to unicolor car paint. There's not that much else to play with. We ignore most of these for most cases. Going over to metallic, what we have is our base coat here. So right now our base color is black, and here it's white. And on top of that base color is a bunch of flakes. Now, these are metallic flakes that let me just make them bigger so we can see them. It kind of generates what flakes look like in paint. And the way these work is a reflected capture a certain amount of light, and based on their color, they capture in that sort of red light onto the surface. So if we've got something black with red flakes, this is kind of what you can expect to see under light. We can play around with all these settings of how reflective they are, which just means how much light it captures. This reflectivity, because it's not set at 0.04, that's one of the ones we can actually play around with and edit. Flake size, pretty self-explanatory. And then we have a flake perturbation, which is how strong the actual shape of the flake is, how it comes through. So you can essentially fade it off completely or crank it all the way up. And then flake roughness is, if I can grab that properly, how rough they are, how much they sort of diffuse out that light across the surface. So a general way of working with these metallics is to have similar colors and to just tweak them around a bit. So, you know, if you go for red and then a bit of orange, or orange and a bit of red, obviously the flake scale on this is cranked right up, the flake size. So when it's a lot smaller, you start to get something that looks very much akin to a metallic car paint. And again, you can turn on the orange peel and it does start to look really cool when it mixes in with those flakes across the surface. These do take a lot of experimentation to get right, depending on how soft or aggressive you want the flakes to actually look. But the reward of it is you get something that looks a lot less flat. So from a distance, you can see there's complexity on this from the lighting. It's not just completely flat. Not that there's anything wrong with having a flat paint on a surface. It's just if you want to have that extra detail, this does provide a really good way to do it. And you can get pretty interesting results when you start to play around with, like, going from reds to blues, or even if it is just sort of like a light and darker blue or whatever it may be. You can get some really cool results with however you play around with these metallic colors. Obviously, you want to try and keep them somewhat realistic and toned down a bit, but doesn't matter. Then when we come across to flip-flop, essentially this is the same thing as metallic, but with mixing in another color. So if we go really strong on this green and really strong on this purple, we can see the purple in the center and the green on the sides. The way it works is depending on the angle of the camera and how you're facing the surface is how strong those colors come through. I might apply it here. So we can see on this, it's not the best example, but depending on the way the camera is positioned, we can see those colors start to come through. So, if we go for something that's like a blue, we've got a lighter blue there, and we've got the green. We start to get those three colors coming through, where, as we can see, the metallic doesn't have that level of color change throughout it. And I guess the idea is that it's flip-flopping between those colors depending on how we look at it. Same sort of settings here for roughness, flake size, flake intensity instead of the perturbation, which is pretty much the same thing anyway. And again, the orange peel option still looks cool. So I'm not trying to say that you should be using the flip-flop car paint option on everything because it's the more advanced option. It's just one way of doing it. So yeah, incandescence, all that means is the object throws off light when we're ray tracing. That's not something very relevant to the idea of car paints or surface paints. Transparency, these generally aren't transparent. Displacement is if it's changes in the actual surface of the body, and blah, it doesn't matter. So moving on from those, we have glass. Now, glass is pretty much what I would use for any transparent material because, well, it actually looks awesome and works really well. You can turn off the reflectivity of it and have it looking very transparent. You can play around with the exterior transparencies, the interior transparencies. It's kind of hard to understand how they work, but you can get some really cool effects, like with the reflection color. You can go for this slightly smoked out look. On glass, I find you can play around with the reflectivity a bit more. It doesn't really matter too much. You can play around with roughness, but that just pretty much makes it solid unless you're doing some ray tracing. Material density sometimes works if you've got dual layers on the material, but in most cases it doesn't really matter. And index of refraction, that's one of those things for ray tracing as well, with how the light actually distorts through an object. So I'm going to turn off material density because otherwise it just goes very dense, obviously. And if we have our index of refraction, we can, when we turn it up or down, we can see it's distorting the image that's behind it, which can actually be super cool, obviously. And if we turn off reflectivity, it kind of just makes it like almost like a lens, which we can see stuff through. But yeah, glass for just about any sort of transparency, it works really well. You can still apply textures to it to distort the surface or add in stuff to it. In most cases, it doesn't need it, and playing around with the index of refraction is really important for getting the sort of look you want when you're trying to render through. Right now, that's actually flipping it, which is pretty cool. But yeah, playing around with it like on a sphere actually makes it look like it's got that thickness modeled in. Again, this is one of those things you have to play with to just understand how it works, because it's pretty complicated with how light actually works traveling through these objects, and ray tracing simulates that. But for a lot of cases, just having it like this works really well. You turn off the reflectivity, and you can get it to look, it just looks like a piece of glass or clear plastic. You can actually add color to this as well. So depending on how light or dark you might make it, you can make it start to look more like a acrylic texture as opposed to glass. You also have these predetermined levels of refraction. So like a diamond has that level of refraction, acrylic at that level. So there's some really cool settings here. There's water at certain temperatures. Depends. It changes how it reflects. And you can actually look up here at the top to see how they change it, how it highlights. But yeah, this is where I would go for any sort of transparent, clear material. Use the glass setting. Then we've got carbon 2D, tire, velvet, woven cloth, line chrome, and Xray. Out of all these, carbon's pretty much the only one I ever use. Tire is very tricky because it's essentially the same settings as plastic, but it's just been in VRED for so long that I don't see how it sort of works. And unless you have actual tire profiles loaded in, it doesn't really do anything. So don't ever use tire. There's no need. Carbon though is really quite useful. So this is for creating like a carbon fiber pattern. I'm just going to scale that up so we can see it. And this is really effective. So any type of carbon fiber you're going to be using, you probably want to be working with this. You can play around with how it actually patterns out. If it's a 5-to-1 weave or 3-to-1 or whatever it is. So that can work really cool, and you can play around with it to get interesting sort of colors going, depending on, I guess, however you like your carbon. What's important with this is to play around with the pattern intensity. Alright, sorry about that. My computer decided to crash randomly, but now the recording's going again. So yeah, with carbon, we can play around with, obviously, the pattern size, our intensity of how we want it to look. Structure kind of works in an odd way with this, where it bumps up on the individual bits. We can kind of see in some of these areas how it sort of adds that woven structure to it. So when you're rendering it out, it looks, oh, that's way too strong. It looks like it's actually woven material. Even then, a bit strong. But you can get some cool results when you play around with that. And from any sort of distance, it looks like it's got that density to it as well, which is pretty cool. Other than that, there's not too much to play around with in carbon. It is, well, just for making things look like they're made of carbon fiber. So generally, they're nice, smooth surfaces anyway that are quite well finished off. So you would expect a flat, reflective surface. Obviously, you can take out the shininess from them if you really want to. Carbon 2D, don't use it. Doesn't really have any benefits over the normal carbon. Tire, we went over that. Velvet. Velvet's an interesting one. It kind of works by creating a soft sort of material which has what's called like the darkening and the fall off. I guess it's somewhat representative of velvet as a material. I don't ever really use it, but you can use it if you're trying to make up a cloth or something like that that's modeled up using freeform tools, really wavy or something. You might actually find that quite useful. Then we come to woven cloths, which are somewhat, I wouldn't say like they're controversial, but they're definitely problematic. So the first thing we can see is we've got this complete pattern throughout it, and we can choose whatever we want, denims or twills or whatever it might be. They take a while to load. So right now it looks like it's trying to crash my computer again, but it should be fine. We can color them however we want. But what we'll find is it significantly decreases our performance on the computer. So in terms of doing any rendering or ray tracing, it's just going to cause a headache. So let's go back to, and even here we can see just purely how long it takes to actually calculate swapping it without any rendering or ray tracing going on. It can look really good when you're doing like car seats or something like that. You can darken up one way as opposed or the other, and sure, it looks fine. But sometimes you can see in the statistics how it's actually working and how many frames you've got, and you might notice on your computers it will run a lot slower when you have a woven cloth on there, but it really is a problem when you turn on ray tracing because it's trying to calculate all of these little woven fibers and everything that's going on. So like we can see the slow progression on that percentage there as opposed to like a unicolor car paint, which if will let me apply it. starts to move a bit smoother, even though it's actually calculating all these reflections in the back as well, which is why it's not racing ahead. But in terms of rendering up anything properly that has some sort of woven material on it, I strongly recommend staying away from that and actually just creating one using the plastics option. And we'll go over making things using the plastics soon. We're almost there. Line chrome, I don't understand what the difference between line chrome and chrome is. It just, except, you know, it doesn't do anything. It just goes kind of clearish. Don't use lime chrome. Xray, this is kind of just for like some weird sort of preview stuff, or like interactive scene things. It can look pretty cool, but again, transparent materials, I generally go with the glass. Then we have these other ones, so like OCS, Substance, Xray, Shattered Multipass Layers, which we won't be going over these. These are sort of like other plug-in things that are made up for VRED, and we won't be going over them at all in this video, which is fine because I rarely ever use them. So now we get to the interesting part of going through some of the features in actually adjusting our materials. So plastics. This is the big material that you'll probably spend most of your time working with. By default, they always start out around here. I always just bring it up to white because whenever we bring in a texture, it still darkens the texture by this amount. And you can take out the roughness of it to make it shiny. So let's start from the top here. Diffuse is the color. The diffuse color is what color is applied to the surface of the object, and you can go from black to white and whatever you want in between there. Probably the easiest part of this to understand. Glossy color is the color of the reflections that come off it. You can go for reds or greens or blues, and you can see they're changing on the outside there. I wouldn't ever change this because in real life, the way these colors are made up, they don't have any sort of inherent color on their glossiness. So I would go with just plain white. Roughness. This is what determines how rough our surface is. And although it might seem a bit counterintuitive, roughness is how I would control the reflectivity of our object. So I always leave reflectivity at 0.04, and I control that by playing with the roughness. So if we do a high roughness of 5, it evens out the whole surface because the surface is considered rough and the light doesn't bounce off it smoothly. It sort of disperses that reflection over a distance. We can see here how it starts to really blur out that. So basically, if you want something to be not very rough, you can play around and have a small setting. And again, if you want it to be super shiny, that's where you use the reflective plastic. Just an example, I'll have these dragged up and that at 25. And we'll do it here. I think they're about the same. And we can see that this is really reflective. Even if we bring this down, the minimum roughness there is 0 or 0.01, whereas this doesn't have any roughness at all. It's just got that really sharp line on it. So if it's going to reflect and be purely reflective, go with the reflective plastic. It gets that super crisp line going across it, which is really great if you're looking for that effect. So coming back to the normal plastic, this is where we get into diffuse textures. Now, a diffuse texture is something we bring on that changes the sort of color of the surface with a texture. So what I'm going to do is I've just got these really basic textures here that I've borrowed from another CAD program. And when I open it, so this is a pattern of oak timber. What it does is it applies that pattern across the surface of our sphere or whatever object it is we bring in. So it's getting information for each little pixel or whatever it is from that image that I've opened. We can see the images here. Alpha allows for transparency. If it's a PNG image, we don't really use that. Cutout transparency is the same sort of thing. We generally want to have this option turned on, which is link texture settings. So if we have another texture in one of these options, it'll link the scales together. Mapping mode, UV mapping is dependent on the surface and in which program you create it. Obviously, spheres in this program are wrapped really well, so UV mapping works great. Planar means it projects it from one sort of direction. And we can see it's projected from the top view here because on the sides it's completely just a bunch of lines that are stretched. And then we have triplanar, which means it's projecting that texture from the top, from the side here, and then from the other side over here. So 3 different planes are projecting onto the object. And we could see that really well on this sphere, where this top section and these side sections are meeting up rather weirdly. So when we come down to here, we have heaps of little... It looks very confusing. Essentially, repeat in the U and V means how many times the pattern repeats. So if we go to 0.5, it changes them all to 0.5 because we've got uniform repeat turned on. I would probably always keep that on. And that just means the less you have of these, the less times it patterns out. And obviously the higher you have that, the more times it patterns out. So that controls how many times your object or your texture patterns across a surface or an object. So we can see that's, probably a good size. And then we have the option to rotate. So what this is going to do is rotate the X plane. So this is the plane in the X direction. And because we've got triplanar turned on, it's just playing with that. So I'm going to leave that at 0. Our Y is now in this direction on this face, and it's rotating that around. And the beauty of this is when we get to this sphere top here, you can play around with how that's actually going to meet up with those, or even more specifically, what we can do is try and make all of them in this cube run together. So if we set this to, 90 degrees, we can see that this and this is going in the same direction. And now what we can do is change our Y. So 90 in that. And, if it's important that it runs up and over that way, like if we're doing an image from here, we can get those to mesh together quite well. But generally you want to have a bit of plan thought out. You might want to apply a different material to this face on the side, because obviously in terms of timber, that doesn't make sense. Glossy and roughness textures. These control where the glossiness of our object is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this bump map file. And if I open that, we'll see it's not very crisp, it's a little blurry, but that's fine. And we'll notice that the glossiness is affected by these dark areas and these lighter areas. So when I apply it, we lose most of our reflectivity because our glossy texture is mostly grey, which is fair enough for a piece of timber. It's not very glossy. And if this was a high enough resolution, we would be seeing that there's no actual sort of gloss in these areas where it's black. But again, it just has the same manipulation settings. You don't really need to play around with any of these other ones. And roughness works in a similar way to glossiness, but you can really control the minimum and maximum roughness of your object through that. So, you might want to just experiment with these. Often I don't use glossiness and I play around with roughness instead, just because it kind of gives that smoother look, but maybe it's a combination of both. You might find is a bit more effective, depending on, how it works, depending on the material and everything else. Then we have the bump texture. With this option, we can either use structure or use texture. So by using a structure, what we do is create our own sort of surface bumps, like we saw with the metals. This just creates a random texture on the surface, which is designed to make it look, well, bumpy. Really good for a lot of plastics and stuff. Obviously, a random bumpy texture doesn't work that well on timber. What we can do is use a bump texture, so we can make these through Photoshop, or we could actually, sometimes you can get away with just using the same image. But in this case, we can see bringing it in allows it to sort of mimic that grain of the timber. We can obviously turn it down. The example I've got is a pretty low resolution one. We might find that by repeating our pattern a bit more like that, it starts to look a bit better when the pattern's smaller. We can see those bumps in the surface coming through. And when we come back across here, it starts to look really quite natural with how all those bumps work in the surface. So bump mapping is really cool. You can change it to displacement mapping. What that does is just changes the way it calculates it. Doesn't really matter. If you're having problems with one, you can maybe try the other and see if it works for you. Incandescence, again, we spoke about this. It shows it makes the object produce light for ray tracing. Transparency, it makes it transparent, but does not work very well with most CAD models. It'll work okay with meshes, but even then, generally it just kind of looks glitchy and weird. And then it doesn't really work well with ray tracing either. Like it does work better, obviously, less glitchy, but it doesn't really look right anyway, having timber materials being transparent, unless we're doing sort of special effects stuff. So in most cases, I would keep that at black. Subsurface scattering, this is where it starts to get really intricate in terms of transparencies. It's about thin, transparent plastic materials or something like that. In most cases, we don't really use it. Displacement has its own setting again here. Most of the time, don't really use it. Just stick with using the bump maps. Ray tracing allows you to play around with overriding settings for the ray tracing. I would strongly recommend not changing any of this. It becomes much more complicated to control your scene when you do this. Rounded edges is something that was brought in one of the latest updates to Fusion. And what it does is it actually tries to round out sharp edges of geometry. So if we turn on ray tracing and anti-aliasing, we can see it tries to sort of round out the outer edges of this. It's kind of effective. I would strongly recommend not using this. If you're a designer, if you've got any CAD skills and you've modeled something up yourself, you should know how to fillet those edges in Fusion or Rhino or whatever it may be. So you don't need VRED to do that for you. And then under Common, this is just how it plays around with lighting in the scenes. I wouldn't change that either. So basically what we do, when we want to create a material, we go plastic, we go and crank that diffused color up. We might want to bring the roughness down to start with, just because we want to play around and don't want it controlling anything already. We come into our diffuse texture, we open something up. So either we've found a texture online that has a seamless pattern, so like these bricks. We bring it in, we come and we just change the amount it repeats, or you could change the texture size in millimeters. I find that just changing the repeats a bit easier because you have to press less buttons to quickly change it. So we do that. We've got our diffuse. Then I will usually do the bump texture next. So use texture, select the brick bump. It loads up. It's got those same options here because our texture settings are linked. And we can just increase the bump so it looks like there's some bumpiness to it. We can play around with what's called parallax intensity. This is one of those things you kind of just have to try, but you can see it sort of looks like it's giving a lot of depth to the grout in it, which is really cool. You can then look at displacement, but displacement starts to get really weird. It's about actually moving the surface of the object off, and it can get quite confusing to try and adjust displacement settings. So I just generally stick with bump mapping. It looks quite good. It does start to look a lot more like a real body just by turning it on and off. You can see that. You can come in and put in your roughness textures or your glossy textures as well. We can see how these look being a flat brick wall. So we can see the glossy texture up here. It still has some glossy elements to it. So that's where we probably would load in the roughness as well. And it kind of flattens it out, but it's not completely flat. There are still some areas that catch a bit of light on it. So that's how I would go about just setting up a texture. Once we plug in the roughness texture, we lose control of this, which is fine. And we can still come in and very slightly tweak it a bit by adding some more color to it. You got to be careful though, because it does just essentially add a level of color over the top. But we can do that if you really want to. It works really great on timbers. So if we have this here, we want to make it a little darker. You just add a little bit of red to it as well as you do it, or a bit of orange, and it starts to look like a bit of a darker timber without giving away too much. So that's just one of the tricks for that. So I think I'll leave that here for now. Next we can go into some of the settings for environments, which are in some way more confusing, in other ways less, because there's less stuff overall. But hopefully that should help you decide what materials to select, or what to create when you start to add materials to your objects, and going through and what settings to change, because it's very overwhelming to open up a material and see all of this, right? There's like 300 different options here, and we just want to make something look like bricks. So it's the problem with VRED can be the interface. It's about understanding it, not being intimidated by it, and just knowing if I go in and change the settings I need to change, it's going to do the things I want. A lot of the settings are there to give control where you might want it or might need it, but generally you don't need to play around with a lot of the default settings. So hopefully this helps. There'll be more to come, again, like I said, on the scenes and how we work around with them next. Thanks for watching.